Hi, everybody. Today we are here to talk about ecology, and so we are in Chapter 3 in your textbook. And so, what is an ecologist? An ecologist is somebody who studies the environment, and they will study the environment along with all of the interactions of the non-living components in the environment. So, ecology is a study of all the interactions among living things and their surroundings. And we're going to be talking about those levels of organization. Now, we've actually talked about like the chemical levels of organization. So we've talked about how atoms, which are the smallest unit, make up matter or make up molecules. And if we headed into a little bit of biology, those molecules would make up organelles that we find in our cells, and groups of cells that were working all together would make up tissues, like your skin tissue, your heart tissue, your brain tissue. And all of your different tissues that are working together would make up your organs, like your heart, your lungs, your kidneys. And those different organs would make up what are called organ systems, like your cardiovascular system, your urinary system, your respiratory system. There's like 11 different systems. And those systems make up you, the organism. And this is where we're going to come back to cells and tissues and organs and organ systems. But right now, we're going to jump ahead and we're going to cover ecology. So we're going to start with the organism, like yourself. And we're going to build up and talk about the levels of organization in terms of ecology. So a biologist might study nature on any of those levels, either from a local or a global scale. And as we know, an organism like yourself is an individual living thing. So we're going to actually be looking at how a group of individuals that are all of the same species living in all of the same area form a population. So a population is a group of the same species living in the same area, forming a population. Now, if those particular populations of organisms are interacting with groups of different species that are living in that area, so for example, if we have the jaguars interacting with the owls, which are interacting with the beavers and the rabbits and the moose, then we have a community, okay? So it's a group of different species that live together in one area. Now, an ecosystem would include all of this, as well as all of the non-living components in that environment. So it would include all of these living organisms, including the plants. And it would include the air and the water and the rocks and the climate and whatever other non-living component you can think of in that environment. And that makes up what we call an ecosystem. Now, there are some major regional or global communities of organisms that are characterized by specific climatic conditions and plant communities that are thriving there. So, for example, if you, and we're talking about a biome here, so if you think about like a water biome versus a tropical rainforest biome versus freshwater, saltwater, the savannas, each of those biomes have specific climatic characteristics, and they have specific plants and communities of organisms that survive there. So ecological research methods, include making observations, just like any good scientist, experimentation, and creating models of what's going on. So what's an observation again? Remember, an observation is For an ecologist, they're going to be carefully watching something over a period of time. They might be watching a population of moose. They might be tagging a population of sea turtles. And they're going to be making both long and short-term studies where they are observing these organisms under different conditions. And these surveys are used to monitor where they're going, what they're doing, what they're eating, and so on. So experimentation may actually involve experiments that are occurring in the field, or they might occur in a laboratory. Lab experiments are much nicer and much easier because they give the researcher more control. But it's an artificial setting, and it doesn't always, represent those complex interactions that might occur between species or within species in nature. And so field experiments actually give a much more accurate picture of what's going on in populations, but it's much more difficult to work with because there's numerous factors involved with doing field research. It could be your weather. It could be your ability to get to that area. It could be the changes in tides. It could be, going from extremely hot to extremely cold. There could be wild animals that are coming out. Maybe rattlers are coming out at the time of the year you need to go out and hike through the middle of the field to throw out. This is what's called a transect. And oftentimes scientists will throw a bunch of these out in a particular area, and they will identify and count all of the species living in that transect. And then that they'll add them all up, and it'll give them some kind of idea of the diversity of species in a particular area. And then we have modeling. And modeling is where scientists are using computer simulations or mathematical models to describe and model nature based upon real data. So they can see how maybe one variable affects another variable. And basically what they're doing is they're creating a virtual ecosystem and predicting what might happen if certain variables are changed. Okay, so let's talk about the difference between biotic and abiotic factors. We already know that bio means living. So biotic is referring to those living factors in an environment. So that would include all of the living things. That would include all of the plants, the animals, the fungi, the protista, the bacteria. And then the abiotic, A before the word means without. So abiotic would be those non-living factors in an environment. So what would those be? Those would be things such as soil, moisture, temperature, climate, wind, sunlight, water, okay? Changing one factor in an ecosystem can have a huge effect on many other factors. Biodiversity, which is all of the different variety of life, is extremely important, and the assortment or variety of living things in an ecosystem depends upon many different factors. The tropical rainforests have the largest biodiversity of organisms anywhere, and new species of organisms are being discovered every single day. Keystone species are species that are extremely important in an environment. They tend to have an unusually large effect on an ecosystem. And if that species was to be lost in that ecosystem, it would cause this ripple effect where other organisms in that population are going to disappear as well. And let's look at an example here. An example here is a beaver. A beaver changes the habitat for many of the different species that might live in this pond. Because what's a beaver doing? A beaver is creating this dam in which now it's causing this backfill of water to occur behind the dam. And in the process, they're creating these nesting sites for birds. They're increasing fish populations in the area, which then, provide food for a larger population of organisms. Waterfowl populations increase because they've got, lots of food sources and shelter. And then it's kind of a protected area for them to raise their young as well. But what happens if you remove the beaver? Well, if you remove the beaver, eventually the dam's going to fail. And when the dam fails, all that water is going to rush downstream. And this beautiful pond that's been built up behind here will no longer exist. So nesting sites for birds go away, nice, safe, calm areas to raise their young fowl goes away. The fish populations end up downstream, and it just creates this domino effect that affects a large number of populations of species. So where does this energy come from in an ecosystem? It comes from the sun. The ultimate source of energy in any ecosystem is the sun. And producers, which are plants, they're also called autotrophs because they're making their energy from the sun. These producers provide energy for other organisms that are living in that ecosystem. And so as a plant, they are making their energy from a non-living source, the sun, and then they are producing this living source of food that consumers, which are called heterotrophs, depend upon, because either they are going to eat the plants directly or they are going to eat other animals that eat those plants. And again, those are referred to as heterotrophs. Now, almost all producers obtain their energy from sunlight. So they're taking in carbon dioxide from the environment, they're taking in water, they're using sunlight to convert that carbon dioxide into carbohydrates. And then those carbohydrates get stored in things like fruits and vegetables and the leaves of these plants. And as a byproduct or a waste product, oxygen is produced, which of course we need in order to survive. Most producers on Earth, as I just said a few minutes ago, need sunlight. And they use that sunlight for a process called photosynthesis. And photosynthesis, what it does is it converts light energy, sunlight, into chemical energy, which is the carbohydrates. So this here is looking at a kind of complicated looking chloroplast, but a chloroplast is found inside of a plant cell. And as sunlight is picked up by the plant cells, it's picked up by these specialized pigments called thylakoids, and they are converting that sunlight energy into ADP and something else called NADPH, and then that is being used as an energy source to take in carbon dioxide and to make glucose, okay? And then again, that glucose gets stored in the fruits and the vegetables and the leaves that other organisms depend upon for food. There's another process that is called chemosynthesis. It's kind of similar, but instead of using the sunlight for energy, they will use chemicals that are available like deep down in the hydrothermal vents, sulfides, for example, that are coming up from the magma deep down underneath the sea floor. And these organisms that are living in the hydrothermal vents will convert those hydrogen sulfides into sugars and other sulfur compounds. Now, it's kind of interesting because some of these organisms that live deep down in these hydrothermal vents can get very large. They don't have a lot of predators. They have a huge amount of food source available with that magma constantly being pumped up. And there are crabs down there that are 3 feet across. There's worms that get to be 6-7 feet long and about 3 feet in diameter. There's clams and mussels that get, 1.5 feet, 2 feet in diameter. They are just huge. And so what we have is the basis for a thriving ecosystem down deep where there's no sunlight available whatsoever. So what's the difference between a food web and a food chain? Well, on this slide here, we have an example of a food chain. And a food chain is a sequence of links that demonstrate to us which species eat who and who they get their energy from. So we are actually only looking at one connection between the producers, which in this case are the algae, and then a single chain of consumers. So what we see here is the zooplankton eat the algae, the small fish eat the zooplankton who eat the algae, the squid eat the small fish who eat the zooplankton that eat the algae, and then the sharks eat the squid who eat the small fish who eat the zooplankton that eat the algae. Sounds like a song, right? So, it tells us who eats who, but these arrows are even more important. These arrows show us the flow in which energy moves through an ecosystem. So algae is getting their energy from the sun. Zooplankton are getting their energy from the algae, but this is showing us that algae is passing on their energy to the zooplankton, and the zooplankton are passing some of their energy on to small fish, and some of their energy is being passed on to squid, and some of their energy is being passed on to the larger fish or the sharks. So it's a very simple way of looking at the flow of energy. All right, so let's talk about the types of consumers that exist in an ecosystem. The first one are the herbivores. The herbivores only eat plants, okay? Then we have the carnivores, and the carnivores only eat animals. So who eats plants and animals? That would be the omnivores. Omni means they eat both plants and animals. Tridivores are organisms that eat detritus. And what's detritus? Detritus is dead organic material. So when these plants die, when these animals die, it's the job of the detritivores to break down that dead organic material. And they do that by scavenging and tearing it apart and digesting it and breaking it into small pieces. Think about what an earthworm does. It goes to the soil and it digests dead organic material, then it poops it out. And that makes or helps to make nutrients available in the soil for further growth and development as plants undergo photosynthesis. Now, we also have things that are called decomposers. Decomposers actually break those organic compounds down into even simpler compounds. So fungi and bacteria, for example, are important to the stability of an ecosystem, and they do that by actually returning those nutrients back into the environment. So organisms may focus on a single organism to feed on, and those are called specialists. So anteaters, for example, are specialists. They only eat ants. Other organisms have a varying diet, and they are called a generalist. Like for here, we have a bird of prey that is eating a snail, but they will also eat rodents and snakes. And so they're what is referred to as a generalist. Okay, so let's talk about these trophic levels. In these trophic levels, we're getting closer to food webs here. But what we're looking at here is we're actually looking at a food chain. And in this food chain, if we talk about trophic levels, the primary producers are at the bottom of the trophic levels. And they're always the first level because remember, these are the organisms that are getting their energy from the sun, and they're turning that chemical energy or that solar energy into chemical energy that then is available for other organisms to eat. So the next level is what is referred to as the primary consumers. These are the herbivores. So the primary consumers are eating the plants. The next level is what is referred to as the secondary consumer. And the secondary consumer eats the herbivores. So they are carnivores. Okay. The next level, or the tertiary level, These will eat the secondary consumers. They may eat the primary consumers, and sometimes they will even eat clear down here the primary producers. Same thing with the quaternary consumers. They may eat the carnivores underneath them, they may eat the herbivores, and they may actually eat the producers as well. Okay, but what this doesn't mean is that the zooplankton are going to eat the carnivores up here. Okay, what it means too is if we follow the arrows are giving us the direction in which energy is flowing. Food webs here are actually multiple food chains that actually demonstrate to us that organisms don't usually just follow one linear chain unless they're a specialist. Most organisms are generalists and they are going to feed on multiple organisms. So, for example, if we look at this, we can see that this mouse here is feeding on grasshoppers, feeding on caterpillars, feeding on some kind of grub here, and feeding on an insect. The ultimate source of energy, though, is the sun. So if we look here, here's the producers. The stability of this entire food web is dependent upon the presence of the producers. If the producers are not present, this whole food web, along with all the associated food chains, is going to collapse. So what we see here then is we see the producers, which are getting their energy from the sun, and then they are producing food. They're producing fruits and veggies and leaves from that sun's energy. And then that energy is passed along to the caterpillars, to the grubs, to the grasshoppers, to the other insects. And those primary consumers can then pass on that energy to the secondary consumers, who can then pass that energy on to the tertiary consumers, who can then pass that energy on to the quaternary consumers. Okay? So these food webs are extremely important. What would happen, like, for example, if I removed a grasshopper? If I removed a grasshopper here, well, this mouse better have something else to eat. This bird better have something else to eat. And as long as it does, it'll probably be okay. But what if I remove the ladybugs and the grasshoppers and the caterpillars? Well, this bird is only going to have these mosquitoes to eat. And maybe that's not going to be enough to sustain a very large population of birds here. And so we may see the decline in the population of birds along with the total removal of the grasshoppers, the ladybugs, and these caterpillars. Okay. Our next section deals with the cycling of matter. And there are a number of cycles that occur in our environment that cycle, for example, water from one place in the environment to another. The water cycle is referred to as the hydrologic cycle, and it's a circular pathway of water on Earth. That water flows from the atmosphere to the surface, below ground, and then back, and it involves humans and other organisms. So the elements that are essential for life also cycle through a variety of ecosystems. And these are what we call biogeochemical cycles. And it's the movement of a particular chemical through biological and geological parts of the ecosystem. So the first one is referred to as the oxygen cycle. And oxygen is cycled through two processes called photosynthesis and respiration. So if sunlight is shining on the leaves and carbon dioxide is being picked up by the leaves along with water, that can be converted into the sugars of the plant, as well as producing oxygen that is a waste product for plants but is required by us in order to breathe. And as part of this oxygen cycle, we are going to use that oxygen for every single cell in our body, and then we are going to produce carbon dioxide, which the plants again will pick up, and then they will fixate that with the help of sunlight and water, and they will make carbon compounds like sugars, like glucose. Our next biogeochemical cycle is referred to as the carbon cycle. And in the carbon cycle, we have a flow of carbon through the environment. Carbon is essential for all organic compounds, all the ones we've been talking about. The carbohydrates, the lipids, the proteins, the nucleic acids are necessary for life, okay? Where do we get carbon dioxide? Well, we get carbon dioxide in the environment when we breathe it out through cellular respiration. We put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere when we burn fossil fuels or we burn wood. We put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere sometimes from our plants because our plants undergo cellular respiration and release it. Detritivores, as they are breaking down that dead organic material, are releasing carbon dioxide to the environment. Animals, as they are breathing out carbon dioxide, which gets released into the environment. That carbon dioxide is picked up by plants. Remember, sunlight is coming in. Water, we water the roots of the plants. And that water and that carbon dioxide is going to be picked up by the plants, and the plants are going to produce the food that's needed by these herbivores and these carnivores, and it's going to be recycled back into the environment. So the simplest transfer of carbon occurs between plants and animals, and it occurs through photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So again, through respiration, we're releasing that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Plants are undergoing photosynthesis. Detritivores and decomposers are breaking down that dead organic material and releasing carbon dioxide back into the environment. Waste material, dead animals, poop, fecal matter is being broken down by those decomposers. And again, carbon dioxide recycled back into the environment. The next cycle, and this is a biogeochemical cycle, is referred to as the nitrogen cycle. And in the nitrogen cycle, there's a conversion of nitrogen gas in the atmosphere into compounds that living things can then utilize. Okay, so nitrogen can be converted by these bacteria referred as denitrifying bacteria. And what happens is as plants break down and plants excrete their urine and their waste material, and we have dead organic material that's breaking down in the soil, these denitrifying bacteria are breaking that material down and converting it into nitrates, for example, that can be used as fertilizer by the plants to grow. And this nitrogen, and we're going to do a project on this in class and look at this a little bit further, but it's the dead organic material that is then going to be broken down by these denitrifying bacteria. That nitrogen is going to be returned to the atmosphere. We're going to breathe it in. Plants are going to use those nitrites or nitrates in the soil for fertilizer so they can grow bigger, and then they get eaten by the animals, and then it all gets broken down again in the soil, and the cycle repeats itself. Now keep in mind, when we breathe, we are breathing in a large percentage of nitrogen. We're breathing in more nitrogen than we are oxygen. All right, so it's the process of nitrogen fixation that's occurring that is actually converting gaseous nitrogen into ammonia, which then can be used by these denitrifying bacteria to convert nitrogen compounds back into nitrogen gas. All right, so our fourth cycle, and this again is a biogeochemical cycle, this is the phosphorus cycle. And in the phosphorus cycle, it's returning phosphorus to the environment. And this is the only biogeochemical cycle where that phosphorus is not ending up in the atmosphere. Oxygen ends up in the atmosphere, carbon ends up in the atmosphere, nitrogen ends up in the atmosphere. as well as the soil. In the phosphorus cycle, it all stays in the soil or in the water. It never goes into the atmosphere. So basically what we have is we have weathering of rocks, the breaking down of rocks, oftentimes due to water runoff or people walking on it, people driving on the soil, rain, sleet, snow, that will all cause weathering of rocks or breaking down of larger rocks into smaller rocks. That's what weathering is. And what happens is as those rocks break down, they release phosphate. And phosphate ends up in our water, which then in a large abundance will cause this overgrowth of plants in our water, which can actually kill our fish. Phosphate that ends in the soil will help to fertilize plants and help them grow. Decomposers will, again, and organisms will eat the plants. That material ends up in the soil. Decomposers will break it down. We'll have some more phosphate leaching into the water. Sedimentation occurs, in which we have new rocks being formed, and the cycle just repeats itself over and over and over. And when we say phosphorus is a limiting factor for plant growth, if plants don't get phosphates, they won't grow. All right, so let's look at some pyramids. Pyramids are really important, and we're going to be doing some activities that go along with this in class. But an energy pyramid, for example, shows the distribution of energy among those different trophic levels. So among the producers and the primary consumers and the secondary consumers and the tertiary consumers and the quaternary consumers. And it shows the movement of energy through those trophic levels. Now, keep in mind, the sun is the ultimate source of energy. So all these ecosystems are getting their energy from sunlight. However, as that sunlight beats down on these plants and these trees, and remember I keep saying some of that energy is passed on to the next trophic level, that means that some of that energy that is gathered from the sun is lost along the way. And as the producers pass some of their energy on to the primary consumers, some of that energy is going to be lost. As that energy is passed from the primary consumers to the secondary consumers, some of that energy will be lost. Okay, so what do we mean that energy is lost? Well, it's not really lost, but what happens is some of that energy is used to drive your metabolic processes, but some of that energy is going to be lost to the atmosphere as heat energy. So energy is used as it's passed along for many purposes, such as movement, growth, maintaining homeostasis, development. Your body, though, is very inefficient at converting the food that we eat into useful energy. And the unused material is going to be excreted as waste material. So that material that's being released as waste material is a lot of it is heat, or a lot of the material that's going to go out with the waste material is going to be heat energy. Now, biomass is referring to how much mass, or the total dry mass of an organism in a particular area. So when a consumer eats a producer, a great amount of energy is lost in the process of heat and waste. And there's something called the 10% law. And in the 10% law, what it's telling us is that only 10% of the energy that is transferred at each trophic level gets passed on to the next trophic level. So, for example, if you're taking in 100% of sunlight energy to the producers, then only 10% of that energy that was available to the producers is going to be passed on to the first level, or those primary consumers, and then only 10% of that, which is 1% of the original 100%, is passed on to the secondary consumers, and only 10% of that, or 0.1% of the original 100%, is passed on to the next level. So in each of those levels, 90% of the energy passed along is lost as heat energy to the environment. And we can measure how much, energy is lost if we know the biomass of organisms that live in that area. So an energy pyramid is what compares energy used by each trophic level. Now, the base of every single one of these pyramids, this is the biomass, how much biomass is made up of producers. And that should always be larger than all of the other levels, because remember, if you don't have the producers, you cannot support the other trophic levels. The whole thing will collapse. So the base of this pyramid is made up of the producers. And this shows that energy is lost in each succeeding trophic level. And how much energy is lost? 90% in each trophic level is lost to the environment as heat energy. And you know this because if you blow into your hands, it's hot energy. If you've ever accidentally touched urine, it's warm. A baby's diaper is warm after they have dirtied it, okay? If you've ever stepped on fresh cat vomit, don't ask me. It's warm. It's disgusting, okay? So all the other pyramid models that we're looking at illustrate an eco's biomass and its distribution of organisms. This is what's referred to as a biomass pyramid. The other was an energy pyramid. It showed us how much energy was passed from one level to the other. This particular biomass pyramid shows me how much, or the mass of organisms at each level. So remember, mass is measured in grams or kilograms. And this happens to show us that there's 1,500 grams of grain and in this particular trophic pyramid, and it is supporting 500 grams of chicken, which supports 50 grams of human tissue. Okay? Now, a pyramid of numbers is a little bit different. These type of pyramids may be this way, but they may also be inverted or upside down if, for example, there was one tree that was supporting a large population of organisms. But in this particular pyramid of numbers, what it's telling us is that there's 1,000 different species of producers at this level that are supporting 100 different primary consumers, that are supporting 10 secondary consumers, which are supporting one tertiary consumer. So, like I said, this could be inverted if you were talking one tree. Think about one apple tree, for example. One apple tree is huge and it's producing a lot of fruit, which could provide home for 100 bugs. So one tree, but 100 bugs that are supplying food for 10 birds, which are supplying food for one owl, okay? All right, so let's go over a couple review questions. The branch of biology dealing with the interactions of organisms and between organisms and their environment is called what? And you should have got this one right, because it's definitely not economy, it's not modeling, it's not recycling, it is ecology. So the part of Earth in which all living things exist is called what? A biome, a community, an ecosystem, or a biosphere. Part of Earth in which all living things exist. That is referred to as the sphere of life, or the biosphere. All of the members of a particular species that live in one area are called what? A biome, a population, a community, or an ecosystem. And you should have chose population. Remember, a community is a bunch of different species living in a particular area. A population is all of the members of one particular species living in an area. Green plants are called producers, consumers, herbivores, or omnivores. Lock in your answer. It should be producers. Okay, what is the original source of almost all the energy in most ecosystems? You better get this right. I said it at least half a dozen times. Is it carbohydrates? Nope. Is it water? Nope. Is it carbon? Nope. It is sunlight. Okay, the algae at the beginning of a food chain in this figure 3.1, what are they called? Are they consumers, decomposers, producers, or heterotrophs? Well, I hope you chose producers because they are the producers in this food chain. Okay, an organism that produces its own food supply from inorganic compounds is called what? So organic compounds are those compounds that contain carbon. Inorganic compounds are those that don't. Inorganic compounds could be like sunlight, it could be water, it could be carbon dioxide. Okay, and when I say, okay, so organic compounds have to contain carbon and hydrogen. I should have clarified that because these organisms are able to use carbon dioxide, which is inorganic because it only has carbon. So I'm glad I was able to clarify that. But what's the answer? Are you surprised? Should have been autotrophs. Okay, which of the following organism does not require sunlight to live? Is that the chemosynthetic bacteria, the algae, the trees, or the photosynthetic bacteria? Well, 3 of those all require sunlight in order to live. The chemosynthetic bacteria, remember those are the ones living deep at the hydrothermal vents, and they are using hydrogen sulfides in order to get the energy that they need to survive. An organism that cannot make its own food is called a heterotroph. They have to eat other organisms that either eat organisms that eat plants or they eat organisms that eat plants. In which way are green plants in a sunny mountain meadow and sulfur bacteria in the deep sea volcanic vents alike? They both use photosynthesis to make their foods? No, there's no sunlight down there at those deep sea volcanic vents. They both produce carbohydrates and oxygen. They both use chemosynthesis to produce their own food, or they both produce carbon and hydrogen. Well, I think you can eliminate C because green plants use what? They use photosynthesis. So are they producing carbohydrates and oxygen, or are they producing carbon and hydrogen? Well, the answer should have been they are both producing carbohydrates and oxygen. Organisms that break down and feed on waste and dead organisms are called what? Well, you should have chose decomposers. Because remember, omnivores eat plants and animals. Autotrophs, they are producing their own energy from sunlight, and so are producers. Okay, what is an organism that only feeds on plants called? A carnivore, an herbivore, omnivore, or detritivore? And you should have chose herbivore. Okay. All right. All of the interconnected feeding relationships in an ecosystem make up a food interaction, a food chain, a food network, or a food web. So all of the interconnected feeding relationships, you should have chose a food web. All right, the total amount of tissue of all the organisms in a food chain is referred to organic mass, trophic mass, energy mass, or biomass. Well, I only mentioned one out of those 4, and the total amount of tissue would be the biomass, so the mass of the living tissue. What is an ecological model of the relationships that form a network of complex interactions among organisms in a community from producers to decomposers? Would this be a food web, an ecosystem, a food chain, or a population? So again, it says an ecological model of the relationships in a network of complex interactions. Were you surprised? Should have been a food web. Okay, what animal eats both producers and consumers? Herbivores, omnivores, chemotrophs, or autotrophs? Okay, you should have chose omnivores. Okay, what is the term for each step in the transfer of energy and matter within a biological community? Is it called an energy path? Is it called a food web? Is it called a trophic level? Or is it called a food pyramid? Well, hopefully you chose the right one because it is trophic levels. Remember, we have the producers, the primary producers, the primary consumers, the secondary consumers, the tertiary consumers, and the quaternary consumers. Those are each of the steps that show the transfer of energy and matter in a biological community. Okay, a bird stalks, kills, and then eats an insect. Based on its behavior, which ecological term describes the bird? So the bird stalks, kills, and eats an insect. Based on its behavior, what's the ecological terms used to describe the bird? Is the bird an herbivore? Well, it's eating an insect, and herbivores eat plants. So is it a producer? No. Is it an autotroph? No. It would be a carnivore, right? And so since it's eating the insect, it is a consumer. So you should have narrowed that down to it is a carnivorous consumer. All right, a snake that eats a frog that has eaten an insect that is fed on a plant is a what? A snake that eats a frog. So he's eating a frog. So the frog is an herbivore. So the frog is a primary consumer. So that means our snake, wait, I got ahead of myself. The frog actually ate the insect that ate the plant. So the insect is the primary consumer. That means the frog has to be the secondary consumer. That means the snake is what? Well, hopefully you chose the third level consumer. Only 10% of the energy stored in an organism can be passed on to the next trophic level. Of the remaining energy, some of it is used for the organism's life processes, and the rest of it goes where? Is it used in reproduction? Is it stored in the body tissue? Is it stored as fat? Or is it eliminated as heat? And I hope you got this right because I really emphasized it. It is eliminated as heat. Which type of pyramid shows the amount of living tissue at each trophic level in an ecosystem? So the amount of living tissue, is that the numbers pyramid, an energy pyramid, a biomass pyramid, or a food pyramid? The amount of living tissue would be referring to the biomass pyramid. Okay, the repeated movement of water between the Earth's surface and the atmosphere is called the water cycle, the condensation cycle, precipitation, or evaporation. And you've known this in second grade. It is the water cycle. Which of the following is not recycled in the biosphere? Is it water, nitrogen, carbon, or energy? And you better have chose energy. Remember I said that energy flows in one direction and one direction only. It flows from the sun to the plants, to the consumers, and then it's lost as heat energy, okay? Or it's broken down by the tropivores, and then it's lost as heat energy. What is the process by which organisms convert nitrogen gas in the air to ammonia? Is it nitrogen fixation, excretion, decomposition, or denitrification? So they're converting nitrogen gas in the air to ammonia, and that is called nitrogen fixation. So they're taking the nitrogen and in the air and they're converting it to ammonia. And it's these denitrifying bacteria that are helping to do this. Okay, how is carbon stored in the biosphere? In the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, underground as fossil fuels and calcium carbonate rock, in the oceans as dissolved carbon dioxide, or all of the above? So, what is the biosphere? The biosphere is the living sphere of life, right? So, is it in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide? Yeah. Is it underground as fossil fuels and calcium carbonate? Yes. Is it in the ocean as dissolved carbon dioxide? Yes. So the answer is all of the above. Okay, nitrogen fixation is carried out primarily by, and I told you the answer to this, is it humans, plants, bacteria, or ammonia? It is bacteria. It is those denitrifying bacteria. Which of the following has a direct role in the nitrogen cycle? Bacteria, legumes, or decomposers, or all of the above? Well, this is where we know bacteria play a huge role in the nitrogen cycle, and the decomposers are breaking down the nitrogen as well. Now, all organisms use ammonia or some form of nitrogen to make up amino acids, to make up proteins, and in other words, they're necessary for life. Through nitrogen fixation, that's where we're going to fix nitrogen into a form that can be then used by plants and other organisms, and these bacteria are going to help do that. Other bacteria will, or plants, I should say, benefit from the nitrogen fixing bacteria when the bacteria actually die and release nitrogen into the environment, or when these bacteria are living in close association with the plant. In legumes, for example, which are like peas and beans and nuts, the bacteria actually live on small little nodules in the roots of these legumes. And within the nodules, these bacteria will undergo nitrogen fixation, in which they are the ammonia that they produce is then absorbed by the plant. And so we have this symbiotic relationship or partnership between the bacteria and the plant. Okay. And anyway, that's what that's talking about. So the answer here is actually all of the above. And again, we're going to look closer at the nitrogen cycle as one of our activities this week. Okay, so biogeochemical cycling ensures that human activity will have no effect on them. Well, human activity has a lot of effect on them. Cells will not become limited in any one nutrient. No, they depend on all of them. Nutrients will not become scarce in any part of the biosphere. They're constantly being recycled. Many nutrients will not reach toxic concentrations in the biosphere. Yes, it is the biogeochemical cycling that ensures that these nutrients will not reach toxic concentrations. Okay, the event that can occur after a lake receives a large input of a limiting nutrient, such as a lot of phosphate or a lot of sulfate. What do you have? Do you have an algae bloom? Algae begins to die and decomposers take over. Nitrogen compounds are recycled, or the concentration of oxygen drops below the necessary level. Well, what you have, remember, you have that rapid plant growth that occurs as you end up with this large input of phosphate. As that phosphate is weathering and being broken down from rocks and ending up in the water, it's going to provide a lot of nutrients for the plants, which is going to cause this algae bloom, which is going to be bad for organisms like fish, and there'll be a huge die-off. All right, so which is most likely to be a limiting nutrient in freshwater pond? And I just told you the answer to that. It is phosphorus. So if a nutrient is in such short supply in an ecosystem that it affects an animal's growth, the animal will become a decomposer? No. A substance is a limiting nutrient? The nutrient leaves the food chain, or the ecosystem will not survive. So if a nutrient is in short supply in an ecosystem that it affects an animal's growth, then that substance is referred to as a limiting nutrient. It's required by that organism, and without it, there is going to be difficulty. All right, so that wraps up our unit on ecology, chapter 3. If you have any questions, make sure you write them down. Make sure you ask them in class or email me. Don't let, figure it out. Get the answers. There's also Bozeman, Amoeba Sisters. You can go back and reread your notes again, reread your textbook. And again, if you have any questions, reach out. See you later. Bye.